Okay, dear friends, and now our panel, our meeting with this special guest. And now I want to tell you just few words and you will meet with him. This is really greatest man. For me, very important, he's man of his word, because several years ago we agreed with him that one day he will come to Ukraine, he will make great gift for Ukraine, for Ukrainians. He has extremely busy schedule. He tried during several years. Finally, 1 year ago, he promised, Victor, I will clean my schedule and I will come. And it was very difficult, but he came. He arrived just now from Paris. After this meeting, he will fly to Lisbon. But today, he will be here. He said, for me, very important to be first time in Ukraine, to meet Ukrainians, especially young Ukrainians. I want to say that he is one of the greatest visionary, greatest leader, greatest fighter against poverty, against HIV, AIDS. By the way, he is really very successful investor. Something else I forgot. Okay, yeah. He is also very gifted singer. Please, please welcome Bono. Yeah.
Very good. Again. Where do you want me here?
Yeah.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah, Farid. No, I will sit there. I will sit there. Okay, Bono, Farid, floor is yours. I already said everything who you are.
Wow, this is quite a treat. First time in Ukraine. Доброго дня. Добрый день. Привет. Привет. Is that it? Yeah. All right. So, since this is your, the mic's on. Hello, hello, hello. Is that a place called Vertigo? Yeah. Since, Victor, maybe I can get your mic instead. Yeah. There you go.
Okay, this is working. So, a big welcome from a city that's been waiting for you for so long. But I have to tell you, at this conference, there's always a guest of honor. And Victor is always able to pull a rabbit out of a hat. And he had, a few years ago, Donald Trump via video. And he had, a couple of years ago, Kevin Spacey. So what this tells me is the omens are you are either going to become the most powerful man in the world, or you are going to have a disgraced sex scandal on your hands. So
which one is which?
that's true, or you might get lucky and get both. But look, let me start by asking you. Everybody here is fascinated by the question of where Europe is going as a symbol, as a metaphor for where the world is going. You're a citizen of the world, but you are also a citizen of Europe. And you've thought about this issue a lot. You've just come from France and Germany. Tell us how we should think about what is going on in Europe and where do you think it's leading? You're going to have to use this. I think you have to, because otherwise it won't carry.
Okay, I'm not good with mic. And again, just apologies for not coming with the band. They're much more fun. But again, I hope that the next time I'm here, I will have Edge, Adam, and Larry. That would be very nice, and we can play some music. But to tell you where I've come from, in the last weeks, our group U2 began a European tour with a very unusual, some would say unsexy idea. which is I published an op-ed in Frankfurter Allgemeine and Le Monde on how Europe is a thought that has to become a feeling. On the idea that really those of us who grow up in Europe, we've taken our Europeanness somewhat for granted. And it's been kind of cold concept. And now, as it's being threatened, and you think that what happened in the Italian elections, you think what happened just this week in Sweden, and you see the very real possibility after Brexit of the dissembling of this beautiful idea that is Europe. And, you know, Victor and Olena wanted me to come here because they say that there's a real respect for European values here in Ukraine, and a real desire that those values are encouraged. And in Europe, we need encouragement right now. And you think about America, and you think of the mythology of America. You think about Hollywood. You think about, I mean, Hollywood was kind of invented to perpetuate the idea of the American dream, you know, and which for a lot of Jewish people was, you know, how to avoid being persecuted. We're all equal, you know, we are all equal. The American dream, we all will live together. But Europe did not have that kind of myth-making machine behind it. Very few artists, there's some exceptions, but very few artists have put themselves at the service of this wonderful romantic idea. And so in our shows now, we're in the middle of the show, we bring up this blue flag with yellow stars. And this is not exactly Bob Dylan Goes Electric or David Bowie wearing a dress. And yet, it suddenly feels defiant, you know what I mean? And I will tell you that people are turning up at the shows with their own flags, European flags, and maybe Brexit in the UK, and the shock of it, is actually turning a younger generation into fervent, passionate believers of this most romantic idea. I'm not saying Brussels is romantic, but Europe is a very, very romantic idea. The idea that everyone can speak a different language and still be understood. How wonderful a thought is that?
Well, and I think you're so right to talk about Europe in these terms, because if you look at even the European Union, you're right, Brussels is regarded as this bureaucratic beast. But what is the European Union? It is the first successful attempt of countries that have waged war for 500 years, that waged 2 world wars with 100 million people dead, to essentially abolish that idea. That France and Germany went to war 3 times between 1850 and 1950. The thought of France and Germany going to war today is unimaginable. And yet it isn't seen as an idealistic project, it's seen as a bureaucratic project. And I think it's people like you who can change that, because you have a way of speaking to people beyond, you know, not through reason, but through the heart.
Yeah, well, I was just speaking with Yala about this, and, you know, artists in the service of such a project have to be careful not to be didactic, have to be careful not to be, not to place too much importance on our service. But I think it's okay. You know, Ireland, just so you know, for those of you who don't know, I'm from Ireland, and Ireland came out of colonialism, came out of the British Empire with the help of poets and, you know, W.B. Yeats and a thriving theatre at the Abbey, and there was some mythology involved in the concept of Ireland. But Ireland was invented by, a lot of mad poets and drinkers and as well as inspired, clever philosophers. It's a beautiful creation, my country. And I sometimes when people say, you're an artist, you should just stick to singing. Why do you involve yourself in this? And I go, but actually, I mean, the whole concept of democracy, going back to the Greek idea, everyone was involved. It was always supposed to have artists and poets. And in Ireland, we've always been like that. And in every pub, in every possible location, they say that the things that you shouldn't speak about are, sex, religion, or politics. That's all Irish people want to talk about. So there you go.
So what would you say? There's so many people here from the political class, politicians, parliamentarians, ministers. One of the great challenges, I think, is that there are people on the populist side in Europe, in the United States, who can speak the language of emotion very well. They evoke a certain emotion, nostalgia for a world that's gone away, fear of the other. These are very powerful emotional reactions, whereas the people, if I may say so, on our side, tend to have 10-point policy programs and explain, technocratically why your life is going to get better with this reform or that reform. How do you get emotion back into how do you get the good guys to speak the language of emotion?
Well, without kissing your ass, you're a great storyteller. A really great storyteller. You're a clear thinker. And in my life, I would say I'm a top-line melody person. I'm looking for clear thoughts. And melodies, great melodies and great ideas have a lot in common. There's a sort of instant, memorable aspect to a great idea. There's a sort of predictable arc. And they feel like they always existed, a great idea. And when you speak, in the Post or Newsweek or on the TV, you have great clarity. I just want to say that. Europe needs better storytellers, that is for sure. And we're trying to improve. The United Nations is something else I care about. Not very good storytelling involved. And I think we have to learn to speak better. We have to sort of dream a little wilder about the things that we've achieved, those great achievements that followed the World Wars. Those things we take for granted, the United Nations. Think of the Declaration of Human Rights. What a beautiful, extraordinary tract. I think about, Europe and coming out of the Marshall Plan and the American investment in that. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word NATO here, but, I think is a good invention. And so, it seemed to me that braver men and women than I, sacrificed a lot to create the space that my group and I and artists of our generation grew up with. And if I'm honest, there was part of me that believed that the world was somehow evolving towards peace and justice, for all. It just, if you went to sleep for a few years and you woke up, there'd be more rights for women or for gay people or whatever. I think my generation thought that. We just thought this was human evolution, and there's no evidence to believe that. Looking over the history of civilization, and indeed, the moment we're in now, we should be a little afraid. We should be a little nervous, and I think what's happened in the last few weeks is we've sort of woken up in the last few years. We've woken up that these things are not inevitable, and that we have to work towards them. We can't take them for granted. And my advice to people is don't agonize, organize. And so what I did with my life in activism was I formed other bands. So the One campaign now has 10 million members. We fight against extreme poverty in Africa. We have 3 million members in Africa. I have Product Red, which Elena is very encouraging of, and Victor. So it's like a red iPhone that pays for AIDS drugs for people who can't afford them. And so not to agonize, but to organize. And I never thought I would feel that way about Project Europe, but I do.
You know, the way you put it, it sounds to me like what you're wondering is most of human history, as you say, is not suggest enormous amounts of progress, certainly not moral progress. And then comes 1945 and the building of a new world, first just in the Western world, Western Europe and the United States, and then when communism collapses, it seems to extend. And in a way, we're trying to figure out, was this an inevitable wave, or are these undercurrents, are these backlashes strong enough that they can reverse the tide?
No, and I don't know enough about this great country, but I know enough to know that you don't have to explain to Ukrainians the meaning and the value of peace and freedom. And you still are fighting for it on a daily basis. And my prayer for you is that you don't have to actually fight for it in any physical sense. Just spiritually would be nice. And what was the expression you were saying about Yalta? Was it? Yeah, I love that salute. It's in Yom Kippur, is it not?
Next year in Jerusalem turns into next year in Yalta, yeah.
Next year in Yalta, that's it. I love that idea.
How do you keep your hope up? Because I remember we met 20 odd years ago when you came to Foreign Affairs, when I was editing Foreign Affairs, and somebody told me Bono wants to come and talk to you about African debt. And I was sure I was going to hear some set of cliches from a celebrity activist. And I was totally stunned by the depth of your understanding. I mean, you could have written articles on the subject. But there was a long time there when you were pushing and nothing seemed to be happening. So how did you keep your hope going when you had, so many options? You could have been out there singing, making lots of money, but you were sitting here.
I did that too.
You did that too, but you could have done more.
Right.
What kept you going?
It was amazing to in Africa, when I was in Africa, you had a problem and still have a little problem with HIV AIDS here. It's not little if you have it. And with the conflict, there's been an upswing. But in the late 90s, early 2000s, in Africa, in certain places in Africa, in a room like this, 1/3 of the people were going to die. 1/3 of the people in certain population centers were going to die. Or a football stadium, and you imagine 1/3 of people going to die. Half the truck drivers on the continent of Africa were going to die. And it seemed to me the very definition of injustice, that where you lived would decide whether you live. And if you lived in Dublin, you got 2 pills a day, and HIV was not a death sentence. But you lived in Lilongwe in Malawi, you had no chance. And so what we tried to do was bring the left and the right to work together, to agree that we could make these drugs available. And so in the United States, we started working with President Bush on what would become the largest health intervention in the history of medicine to fight a single disease. And now I can tell you there's 23 million people in the poorest places on HIV/AIDS drugs. And people did laugh. They thought it was impossible to get these drugs to the rural poor. But I was absolutely sure that if enough people cared across the political spectrum, we could get it done. This was the thing I'm most proud of, is a very simple thing, which is if you can work with your supposed enemy. And this may be a hard thing to say here in the Ukraine. I was talking with Yala about it earlier. In Ireland, we have peace in a country that was ravaged by really a kind of civil war. And I learned the most important word in the English language in that conflict. And the most important word in the English language might turn out to be the word compromise. Compromise is a very underappreciated word. And so fighting HIV, we had people who wouldn't be in the same room with each other. You've had Bill Clinton here on many occasions. He worked with us on debt cancellation. And I remember we had to bring into the room a man who had called him, a religious person who'd called him a devil. He said, he's a Satan, that man. And I said to President Clinton at the time that we might need this man at the meeting. And the president was understood. And we began this really bipartisan work in the United States and indeed around Europe. In the UK, we did it also. And so you had David Cameron and Tony Blair, conservatives and Labour leaders, committing to 0.7% GDP for the world's poor. So trying to find that constituency across political divides became our theme tune at the One campaign.
And you got criticized a great deal when you worked with George W. Bush on the African health issue.
Yeah.
But you managed to do it, and you managed to make him make commitments that all the activists on your side, as it were, never thought he would make, right?
Well, you had Condoleezza Rice here this week. I can assure you that her role was, she will never tell you, was serious and significant, to the point where we would arrive, there was 4 of us at the start of this campaign, and my partners would have Oxfam information or Christian Aid data and statistics in their haversacks. And we would go, and she would want to see the data to see if there was anything she could learn, that the President Bush could learn. In her office, we'd be sitting down there on the floor, going through data. So as well as President Bush, who deserves enormous credit, Condoleezza Rice, Josh Bolton, there was some really key players in this thing, which is Americans should be just so proud of, because they're the largest part of what's called PEPFAR, and also the support of the Global Fund. And one other thing, when President Obama came into office, everyone said to him, that AIDS stuff, that's George Bush. You should do something else. And he said, President Obama, is it working? And they said, yeah, it's working. And he has, in fact, contributed even more on his watch because he was there longer. So I think he's $45 billion in, he was, and 15, or maybe it's 17, with President Bush. But there'd never been this amount of resources. And if I could tell you about what was so extraordinary in my life, if this makes any sense to you, is what I would call unexpected couplings. To be in a photograph with somebody that doesn't make sense. So for a singer from a punk band to be hanging out with nuns and priests and Republicans, and you know, it was tricky for my band, and this was very unhip work, you know. But I think when you're in unexpected company, it's a sort of sign of your seriousness. The other thing was, we left out commerce, because you don't think of activists as involving themselves in the commercial world. But when I was with Steve Jobs, and I went to talk to him about Red, he was saying, but you know, what's great about this is you get our creative department at Apple, and these are the smartest people in the world. And so it wasn't the philanthropy budgets of big corporations, it was their creative teams, because then we could afford a sort of advertising campaigns that we could never reach ourselves. You know, Bank of America are like a big supporter of Red, but they have 17,000 or something branches, and on World AIDS Day they all go red and advertise. We could never afford that. So piggybacking commerce was the next thing, the next unusual juxtaposition for me. So now I'm in photographs with these corporate leaders, and the band are still very unhappy. Like, oh man, he's with those corporate types. But I think that's okay, as long as we are making things a bit better.
When you were in Europe, you met with Macron, you met with Merkel, as you do nowadays. Wherever you go, you see these leaders. What was the mood? Are they dejected? Do they still have hope?
Well, I think it's incredible that Chancellor Merkel did another term. I think she has a wisdom that we really need in the European project. And I'm very grateful that she did that, her public service again. I will tell you, in the meeting, I was a little surprised when she started to speak to me about a Nigerian rapper. I was talking to her about Lagos and how excited I am to be in Lagos. I was talking to her about Africa, just the excitement in Africa, cultural excitement, business excitement, just everything. And Lagos, I said, Lagos makes, you know, New York look like it's asleep. And she said, yeah, you know, this rapper, this Nigerian rapper, he has like 15 million views on YouTube. Have you seen him? I'm like, sorry? The Chancellor of Germany is turning me on to new music. How will I explain this to the band? And I said, no, I actually don't know the rapper. And then she said, and she walked over to her desk and she got an iPad, her iPad. She went, look. Yeah, this one, do you know it? And it was the Nigerian version of the Childish Gambino, This Is America. It was called This Is Nigeria. You should go and see it, it's brilliant. But you wouldn't expect that kind of thing out of the Chancellor. But I wouldn't underestimate anything about her. She's very calm, she's very sure that Europe will prevail. But she's looking also to improve storytelling for Europe. President Macron is like he's a live wire. He's like I don't know, he's very unusual because he doesn't stand by ceremony. So you just get straight into discussing ideas. Are they any good? No, try this one. No, that's no good. And there's no standing by ceremony. I mean, at least with me. And I'm sure he does that with everybody else. The idea is more important than who had it. So I would say a very accommodating, a very accommodating ego.
all of them face, though, this problem of immigration. You know, with Merkel, it was her taking in the million refugees. With every country in Europe, you see populism tied so closely to this issue of migrants, immigrants, refugees. How should we think about this? What would you do if you were advising them on that issue? Because that does seem to be the core of what is provoking so much populism.
Well, I don't think there's anybody, even people who are not paying attention, now know in Europe that what happens in Africa matters to Europeans. I mean, I would go as far as to say, if Africa fails, Europe cannot succeed. I would go that far. And I don't believe Africa will fail. But I think if you listen to the Africans, they are just excited about their own success stories. And they're trying to throw off a generation of leaders that have been corrupt and have not shepherded and stewarded their resources. Africa's so rich. It's this really rich, extraordinary, magnificent place. And I think that this new generation are going to get through. I mean, I have to, you know, we know this probably, but, you know, corruption is killing more children than HIV, AIDS, or malaria. Corruption kills more kids. But there is a vaccine for corruption. It's called transparency. It's called open government. And the civil societies and the youth, there's a huge youth bulge. This will be, can you imagine Africa's going to be twice the size of China in 2050? Can you imagine what the excitement of that? Now, if we don't work with that better, there's no way we can deal with things will change in Europe. I mean, in Europe, what we have is to the north, we have Brexit. To the west, we have the name who shall not be mentioned. You know, and then we have
to the east
we have your problem. Another name that shall not be mentioned. And then to the south, we have the Mediterranean. We're 8 miles away from Africa. And we have to think differently. And we have to just listen to what the Africans are saying, work with them. And, you know, porous borders are a problem for any country. You have to get that right. And unmanaged migration is a problem. But if it can be managed better. But the best way is seeing some really extraordinary, successful countries emerge. And I think what both President Macron and Chancellor Merkel are excited is partnering with those successful African countries. They're looking at new kind of partnerships. And I think they're thinking differently, and I think that's the way through this.
You know, you talked about how Africa will be twice the size of China in 2050. And you said, imagine the excitement of that. And it just struck me, just the way you said it and what you said, it reveals just how profound your optimism is. I think a lot of people, when they think of the idea of Africa being twice the size of China, shrink in fear or, you know, at least puzzlement. What is it that keeps you so you know, you seem to have a core optimism about the human race.
Well, just, I'm not, you know, Africans are just entrepreneurial by nature. I remember sitting with Meles Zenawi, president of Ethiopia, and he said, you know, farmers are the most entrepreneurial people, the smartest people in our country. And I said, why do you think that, Mr. President? He said, because in recent times, if they weren't smart or entrepreneurial, they'd be dead, referring to some of the, you know, the stresses and in their agriculture. So I think hierarchical societies are are not made for the 21st century. I think more anarchic thinking people, people who, the cliche is, you know, think out of the box. I mean, if you were asking who's going to dream up the 21st century, who's going to dream up, say in the 80s, you might look and think, well, the Germans are great at engineering. They'd have a shot at it. The British are brilliant inventors. And the Japanese are, you know, gods of microcircuitry and, you know, and, you know, you could go through a list of countries that you think, but it turned out it was pot-smoking hippies from Northern California who dreamt up the 21st century. Anarchic thinkers like Steve Jobs and, you know, Paul Allen, and listening to Jimi Hendrix. I remember saying to Bill Gates, I said, you know, you probably didn't listen to Jimi Hendrix, so did you, Bill? And Bill goes, are you kidding me? I was in the office with Paul Allen for 18 hours a day. My brain has been shaped by Jimi Hendrix. So I just think that problem solvers come from, I think in India, you see natural entrepreneurial talent. I like to think Irish people are entrepreneurial and anarchic thinkers. We shall see. And I'd like to think the Ukrainian people are innovative by nature. That's what I hear. But if you're hierarchical, you're fucked.
On that note of warning, can we end the conversation and ask Bill McGlashan to join us?
The new band, my new band.
Bono, you know what? There are very few moral leaders in the world left, and I think you just heard from one of them. Thank you, Bono.
Thank you very much. I can't live up to that, but okay.